Some prisoners left behind more than memories, because long after the guards rotated out and the war itself ended, colors and shapes remained on certain walls across American bases. And years later, people working in those buildings would discover paintings quietly signed by men who were once enemy soldiers, which raises a strange question about why prisoners, living far from home behind fences, were given brushes and paint, and what they chose to leave behind when they knew they might never see those walls again. When the first groups of German prisoners arrived at certain American bases in the middle years of the war, they were processed with routine efficiency and assigned to barracks that were practical rather than harsh. And after the initial weeks of adjustment, many camps began organizing structured daily schedules that included labor, maintenance work, and supervised activities meant to keep hundreds of men occupied for long hours. Because idleness inside a fenced compound could quietly become its own problem. And within this system, some prisoners who had civilian trades before the war gradually revealed skills that went beyond farming or carpentry, since among them were sign painters, decorators, art students, and men who had once painted shop windows or church interiors in their hometowns. And American officers who managed these camps often believed that keeping prisoners mentally engaged reduced tension and disciplinary issues, which led to small projects where artistic skill became unexpectedly useful, especially in places where base facilities needed simple beautification or signage. And what began as practical tasks, such as labeling storage rooms or painting directional signs, slowly expanded into more elaborate decorative work on interior walls. Because once a man demonstrated steady hands and patience with a brush, he might be asked to add a scene or emblem to brighten a dull hall used by staff or trainees. Inside these camps, the materials were basic and closely supervised. Yet even limited paint and rough brushes allowed careful work when time was available, and time was something prisoners possessed in large amounts, which meant that a quiet corner of a building could become a workspace where a small group focused on mixing shades, sketching outlines, and filling large surfaces with controlled strokes, while guards observed without seeing any security risk in landscapes or symbolic scenes. And many of these images avoided politics or propaganda, since prisoners understood that neutral subjects such as countryside views, animals, village streets, or idealized European scenery were safer choices that would not raise suspicion. And for the men painting them, these images were often drawn from memory, recalling forests, rivers, or town squares far away across the Atlantic, which gave the work a personal meaning that went beyond decoration, because each scene allowed a painter to revisit familiar places in his mind, even while confined behind barbed wire in an unfamiliar land. American personnel who passed through these rooms sometimes viewed the murals simply as pleasant background art that softened the starkness of military buildings, and reports from several camps suggest that some officers even encouraged neat workmanship because it reflected order and discipline. Yet for the prisoners, the act of painting carried a quieter psychological value, since concentrating on proportion, shading, and perspective could absorb the mind for hours, reducing the weight of uncertainty about the future. And this atmosphere created a strange contrast where enemy soldiers, held far from the front lines, contributed to the visual environment of the very bases supporting the war effort, not as collaborators, but as men filling long days with the only tools available to them. And over time, certain walls became known informally among staff as the places where the German artists worked, though few imagined that these images would survive beyond the war itself. As months passed and rotations changed, some murals were covered by routine repainting, while others remained simply because no one saw a reason to remove a well-painted scene, and buildings on large bases often served many purposes over decades, which meant that a decorated basement or hallway might remain untouched through renovations. and the painters themselves rarely knew what would happen to their work, because most expected eventual repatriation and assumed that anything they created inside a temporary camp would disappear once the conflict ended. Yet the careful way many murals were executed, with balanced composition and durable paint, unintentionally increased their chances of survival. And so, without any grand intention, these quiet artworks began a slow journey into the future, fixed to walls that would outlast the circumstances of their creation. As the mural projects continued in some camps, the process often followed an informal but consistent pattern where a supervising officer or civilian staff member identified a plain interior space that could benefit from decoration. And once permission was granted, a small group of prisoners with known artistic ability would be assigned under watch to prepare the surface, which involved cleaning walls, smoothing rough areas, and sometimes applying a light base coat that allowed colors to stand out more clearly under the dim lighting common in utility buildings. And this preparation stage required patience and coordination because materials were limited and mistakes could not easily be corrected. Yet many prisoners treated the task with seriousness, understanding that careful work earned trust and occasionally led to slightly more comfortable assignments compared to heavier labor details outdoors. Within these painting groups, roles quietly emerged where one man might specialize in sketching outlines, another in mixing tones from the modest selection of pigments provided, and another in filling large areas with steady, even strokes. And this cooperative rhythm resembled workshop habits some of them had known in civilian life before the war, which gave the activity a familiar structure that contrasted with the uncertainty of captivity. And guards observing these sessions sometimes noted the calm focus that replaced the restlessness often seen in idle hours, because a man concentrating on balance and color rarely caused trouble. And for camp administrators, this calm atmosphere reinforced the idea that structured creative work supported order inside crowded compounds. The subjects chosen for these murals were rarely random, since prisoners learned quickly which themes were acceptable and which could invite unwanted attention. And as a result, many scenes featured natural landscapes, distant mountains, quiet lakes, rural roads, or small town buildings that suggested peaceful routines rather than conflict. And occasionally decorative patterns or symbolic motifs appeared around doors and hallways, adding simple visual interest without conveying political meaning. And some painters subtly included elements from memory, such as the shape of a European farmhouse roofline or the curve of a familiar riverbank, details that might pass unnoticed by American viewers, yet carried private resonance for the artist, turning the wall into a quiet bridge between past and present. Over time, stories circulated within camps about which locations had the best painting details, and new arrivals sometimes heard that a certain barracks or service building contained artwork done by earlier groups, which created a small sense of continuity among men whose circumstances otherwise felt temporary and disconnected. And although these murals did not change their status as prisoners, they offered moments where skill rather than rank defined a man's role, and this shift mattered in subtle ways because it allowed identity to be tied to craftsmanship instead of captivity, even if only for a few hours each day. American staff who worked in these buildings often grew accustomed to the presence of murals and sometimes forgot they were created by prisoners at all, seeing them simply as part of the environment. And this quiet normalization illustrates how daily routines on the home front could blur the sharp lines suggested by wartime propaganda. Since practical cooperation inside camps focused more on management and stability than on symbolism, and while no one at the time viewed these paintings as historical artifacts, their careful execution and neutral themes helped them avoid removal during routine maintenance, especially in lesser-used rooms where repainting was infrequent. As the war progressed and camp populations shifted, some painters were transferred, repatriated, or reassigned to other duties, leaving their work behind without ceremony. And the walls remained silent witnesses to changing rosters and passing seasons, holding images that neither advanced nor opposed any cause, but simply existed as traces of human effort during confinement. And in that sense, these murals became quiet records of how individuals adapted to unusual circumstances, using whatever skills they carried from their previous lives to shape their immediate surroundings, even when those surroundings were defined by fences and guard towers rather than freedom. As murals slowly accumulated across different facilities, a less visible but meaningful effect emerged in how prisoners related to time itself. Because days that once blended together through routine counts and scheduled meals began to acquire small milestones tied to artistic progress, such as the completion of a background scene, the careful shaping of a figure, or the final outlining of a border. And these incremental goals provided a structure that divided the long months into manageable segments, allowing men to measure their endurance not only by calendars, but by layers of paint drying on plaster. And this psychological shift was subtle yet important, because captivity often erodes a sense of forward movement, whereas a creative project, even a controlled one, implies that tomorrow will be used to finish what today began. In several camps, oral recollections later described how fellow prisoners would quietly visit permitted areas just to glimpse a mural in progress, not out of idle curiosity, but because the sight of color and imagery inside otherwise plain buildings offered a reminder that human expression could survive even in regulated environments. And while conversation around these works remained cautious to avoid misinterpretation by guards, there was a shared understanding that such projects represented more than decoration, since they demonstrated that skill and memory still had value. And this recognition helped preserve personal dignity in a setting where individuality was often reduced to numbers and rosters. American personnel who interacted regularly with POW labor details sometimes noticed that men assigned to painting tasks maintained steadier discipline and fewer infractions, which administrators interpreted as evidence that purposeful activity reduced tension. And for that reason, some camp leaders quietly supported additional decorative projects in mess halls or recreation spaces, not as favors, but as practical management, because a calmer camp required fewer interventions, and this pragmatic approach meant that art existed within clear boundaries, shaped by oversight yet still leaving room for careful creativity, and the balance between permission and restriction defined how far any mural could go in theme or scale. The materials themselves influenced outcomes, since wartime supply limitations meant that painters often worked with house paints, diluted pigments, or repurposed brushes, and these constraints encouraged simple compositions with broad areas rather than intricate details. Yet many artists compensated through composition, using contrast and perspective to give depth even when color variety was limited. And this resourcefulness reflected habits formed during years of scarcity in Europe, where making do with available tools was already familiar, and thus the murals became not only visual works but demonstrations of adaptability under constraint. Weather and environment also played a role, because humidity, heat, or cold inside certain buildings affected how paint adhered to surfaces, leading some murals to fade or peel within months, while others lasted longer purely due to placement in drier rooms, and no one at the time prioritized preservation. So survival often depended on chance rather than intention. Yet in a few locations, the combination of solid walls and stable conditions allowed these paintings to remain intact well beyond the war's end, quietly embedded in structures that would later be repurposed for entirely different uses. For the prisoners themselves, the act of stepping back to observe a finished wall could bring a complicated mix of pride and distance, because the image belonged to a place that was not home and to a time they did not choose, and yet it still carried their hand and eye. And this duality captured a core reality of POW life in America, where daily existence combined restriction with moments of unexpected normalcy. And within that narrow space between control and expression, a painted wall could hold more meaning than its subject suggested, serving as a quiet statement that even under guard, a person could still shape a small part of the world directly in front of him. As the war moved toward its later stages and the outcome in Europe gradually became clearer, the daily life inside many American POW camps also began to shift in subtle ways, because planning for eventual repatriation and transfers introduced administrative changes that affected routines. And within this transition, the murals on certain walls quietly remained while the men who painted them prepared, often without precise dates, for the possibility of leaving the places where those images had been created. And this approaching separation gave the artwork a different meaning, since what had started as a way to pass time now stood as a fixed mark that would outlast their presence. Some painters were reassigned to other duties or moved between camps as populations were reorganized, and when this happened, the murals they left behind rarely received special acknowledgement, because the camp system focused on logistics rather than sentiment. And yet among prisoners, there was an unspoken awareness that a finished wall might be the only visible trace a man left in that location, especially for those who had no local records beyond name on a roster. And this awareness sometimes led artists to complete projects carefully even when they suspected they would not see the result for long. American base personnel, for their part, often treated the paintings as part of the facility once they were finished. And in buildings used for training, storage, or recreation, a well-executed mural simply blended into the environment, noticed by some and ignored by others. And this normalization reduced the likelihood that anyone would remove the images unless a wall required repainting for maintenance, which in busy wartime operations was not always a priority unless strictly necessary. In a few cases, later recollections describe staff who remembered that certain murals were done by the German artists. Yet even then the memory attached more to the practical story than to the individuals, because wartime administration emphasized function over personal history. And as years passed, names were easier to forget than painted scenery on a familiar wall. And so the artwork remained, while personal attribution gradually faded. Buildings on military bases often changed roles after the war, turning from training spaces into offices, warehouses, or support facilities. And when such transitions happened, interior walls were sometimes left untouched if they caused no problem, and a landscape or decorative border did not interfere with paperwork or storage, which allowed certain murals to survive simply because they were harmless and already there, not because anyone set out to preserve them as historical artifacts. For the former prisoners who eventually returned home, most never knew which of their works remained and which were covered over, because communication about such details rarely traveled across post-war borders, and the focus of repatriation centered on reintegration into civilian life rather than on the fate of paintings left on distant bases. And this distance meant that the murals' later survival existed largely outside the knowledge of their creators. Still, the fact that some of these images endured into peacetime buildings created a quiet historical overlap, where traces of captivity remained inside spaces, serving entirely new purposes. And this overlap illustrates how physical environments can carry layers of past use without announcing them, holding visual echoes of events that daily routines gradually forget. In this way, the murals entered a new phase not as active projects, but as background elements in post-war America, and their continued presence depended less on intention than on circumstance, on whether a wall was repainted, a building renovated, or a room left largely as it was, and through this combination of chance and practicality, certain painted scenes quietly crossed from wartime necessity into historical residue, fixed in place while the people connected to them moved on. As the post-war years extended into decades and American military installations continued to expand, relocate, or modernize, the buildings that once held POWs often entered entirely new phases of use. And within these transitions, some murals quietly remained in lesser-used corridors, storage rooms, or older structures that saw little renovation. And their survival depended less on recognition than on simple practicality, because repainting or remodeling required time and resources. And if a painted wall caused no problem, it was often left alone. Occasionally, maintenance workers or new personnel assigned to an older building would notice a scene that seemed stylistically different from standard military decoration. Perhaps a landscape with European architectural hints or a decorative border that felt out of place for a utilitarian structure. And these observations sometimes led to quiet questions about origin, though answers were not always immediately available, since records rarely tracked interior artwork created during wartime. Operations. In a few documented cases over the years, local historians or long-serving staff connected certain murals to the period when German POWs were housed on or near the base, and this connection usually emerged through archive camp records, veteran recollections, or regional historical research rather than official preservation efforts. And when such links were confirmed, the paintings gained a modest historical interest as artifacts of daily POW life rather than as formal works of art. What made these murals notable was not artistic fame, but context, because they represented moments where individuals in confinement applied personal skill within strict boundaries. And this context turned ordinary decoration into a quiet historical trace, showing how war affected not only battlefields, but also the interiors of buildings far from combat zones. Still, many murals likely disappeared over time as buildings were renovated or demolished, and this gradual loss reflects how physical traces of history often fade unless deliberately protected. Yet the few that remained offered tangible evidence that POW camps were places of routine management and human adaptation, as well as security. For modern observers who encounter such artwork, the experience can be quietly striking, because a painted wall from the 1940s inside a functional facility connects present-day spaces to past circumstances in a direct visual way. And this connection does not dramatize history, but grounds it in everyday environments. The murals also remind us that the people who created them were not abstract figures and records, but individuals carrying trades, habits, and memories from civilian life. And those personal backgrounds sometimes shape the small contributions they made even while confined, whether through painting, craftsmanship, or other skills. Over time, the surviving examples have become less about decoration and more about documentation, offering insight into how POW programs operated in relatively stable domestic settings where labor and structured activity were part of camp management. And these details help complete a fuller picture of wartime society beyond combat narratives. In the broader story of World War II, such murals occupy a small place. Yet small places matter in historical understanding, because they reveal how large events are experienced through ordinary actions, and painting a wall under supervision may seem minor, but it reflects how individuals navigated unusual circumstances using familiar abilities. By the end, the legacy of these paintings rests not in their visual style, but in what they represent: a quiet intersection between captivity and creativity, between regulation and personal expression, and between temporary presence and lasting trace, showing how even controlled environments can carry subtle marks of the people who passed through them. In the end, the murals did not change the course of the war, did not alter the status of the men who painted them, and did not serve any official purpose beyond modest decoration. Yet they remained as quiet traces of how individuals adapted to confinement using the skills they carried from their previous lives. And this adaptation reveals a side of wartime history that unfolds far from battlefields. Inside ordinary buildings where daily routines continued under supervision. What makes these paintings meaningful is not their artistic mastery, but their context, because they show that even within a controlled system, small spaces existed where personal ability could shape the environment. And recognizing this adds nuance to how POW life in America is understood as a mix of regulation, labor, and moments of human normalcy. For the prisoners, the act of painting likely began as a way to pass time and fulfill assigned duties. Yet the results sometimes outlasted their stay, turning temporary work into lasting marks. And this contrast between short presence and long survival gives the murals a quiet historical weight. For the bases and buildings that carried these images forward, the paintings became part of layered spaces where past and present overlap. And such overlap reminds us that history often remains embedded in everyday places without drawing attention to itself. Many murals have been lost to renovation and time, and this loss reflects how easily physical history can fade when it is not formally preserved. Yet the few that remain offer tangible evidence that POW camps were not only sites of custody, but also places where human skills continued to function within limits. These walls, when they still exist, do not speak loudly about conflict or politics, but they quietly record that the men who stood on the opposite side of a global war were also painters, craftsmen, and civilians before they were soldiers, and that complexity matters in understanding the full picture of history. And so the story of these murals settles not as a tale of art, but as a reminder that even in confinement, people leave small marks behind. And sometimes those marks endure long enough to tell future generations that history is made not only by major events, but also by the quiet work done on ordinary days in unexpected places. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.